The worst betrayals do not begin with a slammed door or a cruel argument. They begin with a simple act of trust. 3 months ago, I handed my daughter-in-law a spare key to my house, and before the sun had set that same day, something inside me started whispering that I had made a terrible mistake. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 71 years old, a widow, and until recently, I believed that trust was something you earned by giving it. After my husband, Richard, passed away 5 years earlier, I learned how quiet a house could become. The sounds that once filled every room disappeared little by little. No television playing in the den. No footsteps crossing the hallway. No voice asking what I wanted for dinner. Just silence. Over time, I adjusted. I built routines. I watered my roses every morning. I drank coffee on the back porch. I attended church every Sunday. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. My son Michael worried about me more than I worried about myself. He called often, and his wife Lauren stopped by several times each week. At first, I appreciated the attention. Lauren would pick up groceries when I needed them. She would help carry heavy boxes from the garage. She even offered to drive me to appointments during a period when my car was being repaired. I told my friends how fortunate I was to have such a caring daughter-in-law. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the version of the story I wanted to believe. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, Lauren stopped by after work. We sat at the kitchen table drinking iced tea while sunlight poured through the windows. The conversation felt ordinary. She mentioned how worried she felt whenever I did not answer my phone right away. She talked about emergency situations and how difficult it would be if something happened while no one could get inside the house. Her concerns sounded reasonable, thoughtful even. By the time our conversation ended, I found myself opening the kitchen drawer where I kept my spare keys. I remember holding the small silver key in my hand. I remember smiling as I placed it in hers. Just in case, I said. Lauren immediately stood up and hugged me. "Thank you, Evelyn," she said. "This will make everything easier." At the time, the words seemed harmless. But something about the way she said them stayed with me. Not the words themselves. The tone. There was a confidence in her voice that I could not quite explain. After she left, I tried to ignore the feeling. I spent the afternoon tending my garden and reading on the porch. Yet her words continued echoing in my mind. This will make everything easier. Easier for whom? That evening, Michael called to check on me. We chatted for a few minutes before he mentioned something unexpected. "Lauren said you finally gave her the key," he said. She seemed really excited. Excited. It was an odd choice of words. Most people would feel grateful, relieved, appreciative. Excited felt different somehow. After the call ended, I stood by the living room window watching darkness settle across the neighborhood. For the first time in years, my house did not feel exactly the same. Nothing had changed. Every piece of furniture remained where it belonged. Every photograph still sat on its shelf. Yet a strange uneasiness lingered in the air. And as I locked my front door that night, a question entered my mind that I could not shake. Why had Lauren seemed so happy to have access to a house that was never hers to begin with? The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, something I rarely did anymore. A faint feeling of uneasiness had followed me into my dreams and stayed with me when I opened my eyes. I tried to dismiss it. After all, I had known Lauren for more than 15 years. She was family. Families helped each other. Families shared responsibilities. Families trusted one another. At least that was what I had always believed. After breakfast, I drove to a nearby garden center to buy a few plants for the front flower beds. It was one of those beautiful spring mornings when the air felt fresh and the sky seemed impossibly blue. I spent nearly 2 hours browsing flowers, chatting with employees, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being outside. When I finally returned home, something immediately felt different. I could not explain why. Nothing looked damaged. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet the house felt as though someone had been walking through it while I was gone. I set my shopping bags on the kitchen counter and slowly looked around. The decorative bowl that usually sat near the refrigerator had been moved several inches to the left. A framed photograph of Richard and me had been turned slightly toward the dining room. Even one of the kitchen chairs seemed positioned differently than I remembered. Small things. Ridiculously small things. I almost laughed at myself for noticing them. Then I walked into the living room. That was when I stopped. A stack of magazines that had been sitting neatly beside my reading chair was now arranged on the coffee table. Not randomly. Deliberately. Someone had moved them. I stood there for several seconds. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I had done it myself. At 71, you occasionally question your memory before questioning anything else. Yet deep down, I knew I had not touched those magazines. Later that afternoon, Lauren called. Her voice sounded cheerful, casual. We talked about ordinary things for a few minutes before she said something that caught my attention. I stopped by earlier to make sure everything was okay. I froze. You were here. There was a brief pause. Of course. You gave me the key yesterday. I looked around the room. Suddenly, every small detail seemed much larger. You came inside? I asked. Just for a minute, she replied. I wanted to check on things. Check on things. The phrase sounded harmless. Helpful even. But I had never asked her to come by. I had not told her I would be away. She had simply decided to enter my home because she could. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my favorite chair and stared at the family photographs lining the mantel. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Lauren probably thought she was being responsible, thoughtful, caring. Yet another part of me kept returning to the same uncomfortable fact. Less than 24 hours after receiving the key, she had already used it without asking. As evenings settled across the neighborhood, I found myself paying attention to details I had never considered before. The key was supposed to be for emergencies. That was the understanding. That was the reason I gave it to her. Yet somehow the boundary had shifted almost immediately. And as I sat alone in the quiet house, another troubling thought entered my mind. If Lauren felt comfortable walking into my home today without permission, what else might she eventually feel entitled to do tomorrow? Over the next several days, I tried to convince myself that what happened was a simple misunderstanding. Lauren had always been confident. Perhaps too confident at times, but confidence was not a crime. I told myself she probably believed she was helping. Yet the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The following Saturday morning, I left the house early to meet a friend for breakfast at a small diner across town. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about grandchildren, retirement, and all the ordinary things people discuss when they have known each other for decades. By the time I returned home, the sun was high and the neighborhood was quiet. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed another change. The curtains in my living room had been opened wider than usual. It was not dramatic. Most people would never have noticed. But I noticed because those curtains had remained exactly the same for nearly 5 years. Richard had always preferred them partially closed to keep afternoon glare off the television. I had never changed them after he passed away. Standing there, I felt that same strange sensation I had experienced a few days earlier. Someone had been making decisions inside my house. Small decisions, quiet decisions, decisions that were not theirs to make. Later that afternoon, Lauren stopped by carrying a large iced coffee and smiling as though nothing was unusual. We chatted in the kitchen for a few minutes. Then she casually mentioned that she had been thinking about my living room. The space would feel bigger if you moved that bookshelf to the other wall, she said. I looked at her. What bookshelf? She pointed toward the den, the one beside the fireplace. My stomach tightened slightly. It was an odd thing to say because she had never shown much interest in my furniture before. I like it where it is, I replied. Lauren laughed. You might change your mind eventually. Eventually. There was something about that word that lingered long after she left. Over the next week, similar comments began appearing more often. She suggested replacing the guest room curtains. She mentioned repainting part of the hallway. One afternoon, she even commented that the master bedroom would look brighter with lighter furniture. Every suggestion was presented as friendly advice. Helpful advice. Yet all of it carried the same underlying assumption. She was speaking as though the future of the house somehow involved her. One evening, Michael and Lauren came over for dinner. During the meal, Lauren casually referred to my home as the family house. No one else seemed bothered by the phrase. Michael certainly did not react. But I noticed it immediately. Because for nearly 40 years, I had called it my home. Richard's home. The place where we raised our son. The place filled with memories. Hearing someone else redefine it felt strangely unsettling. After dinner, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while Michael carried leftovers to the refrigerator. Through the open doorway, I could hear Lauren walking through the living room. Then I heard something that made me stop. This room has so much potential, she said softly. It sounded less like admiration and more like ownership. I did not confront her. I did not mention it to Michael. Instead, I dried my hands and quietly looked around the room. For the first time, I realized the problem was no longer the key itself. The key had simply opened something larger. It had given Lauren access not only to my house, but to the idea that she could shape its future. And the more comfortable she became, the more I began to wonder exactly what future she had already imagined. About 2 weeks later, I experienced the moment that changed everything. Until then, I still allowed myself to believe there might be another explanation. Maybe Lauren was simply overstepping without realizing it. Maybe she was trying too hard to be helpful. Maybe all the comments, suggestions, and little changes around the house were nothing more than poor judgment. That possibility disappeared on a Thursday afternoon. I had gone to a grocery store about 15 minutes from my neighborhood. It was a place I visited often, and I knew many of the employees by name. After filling my cart, I stopped near the bakery section to talk with a woman named Sandra who lived 3 streets away from me. We were discussing the unusually warm weather when she smiled and asked a question that made no sense at all. "So when are you making the move?" she asked. I looked at her. "What move?" Sandra appeared surprised. "The retirement community." I thought everything was already arranged. For a moment, I honestly wondered whether she had mistaken me for someone else. "I am not moving anywhere," I said. Her expression immediately changed. "Oh, I am sorry. Lauren mentioned that you were planning to downsize soon and that Michael and Lauren would probably stay in the house afterward." The words hit me harder than I expected. I forced a smile and changed the subject, but the conversation stayed with me for the rest of the day. On the drive home, I replayed every detail in my mind. Lauren had never discussed any retirement community with me. I had never expressed interest in moving. In fact, I loved my home. Every room carried memories of Richard. Every wall told part of our family's story. The idea that I would quietly leave it behind was absurd. Yet somehow another person believed that plan was already underway. When I arrived home, I sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window for nearly an hour. Then I remembered something. A few months earlier, another neighbor had casually asked whether I was thinking about simplifying my lifestyle. At the time, I assumed she was making ordinary conversation. Now I wondered where that idea had originated. The following Sunday after church, I found myself paying closer attention during conversations. To my surprise, similar comments surfaced again. One woman mentioned hearing that I was considering a retirement village. Another person asked whether Michael planned to renovate the house after I moved. Each comment sounded harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. A story I had never told. That evening, I opened a notebook and wrote down everything I could remember. Names, dates, conversations, questions people had asked. By the end of the night, an uncomfortable picture had begun to emerge. Somewhere along the way, people had started viewing my home as a place I would eventually leave rather than a place I intended to keep living in. The most troubling part was not the rumor itself. It was how confidently others seemed to believe it. Rumors do not spread without repetition. Assumptions do not become accepted facts without encouragement. As I closed the notebook and prepared for bed, I realized the situation had become much larger than a spare key. Lauren was not simply acting as though she belonged in my house. She seemed to be quietly helping others imagine a future in which I no longer did. Once I started paying attention, I realized the rumor had traveled much farther than I originally thought. It was not just one neighbor. It was not just one awkward conversation at a grocery store. During the following week, pieces of the same story appeared again and again. On Tuesday morning, I attended a church luncheon. While waiting in line for coffee, a woman I had known for years smiled warmly and asked whether I was excited about my next chapter. I politely asked what she meant. "Your retirement community," she said. "I heard it is a beautiful place." I smiled, but inside I felt something sink. By then, the pattern was undeniable. Someone had been planting the same idea in different places, with different people, over an extended period of time. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. I began writing down every conversation I could remember, every comment, every assumption, every person who seemed convinced that I would soon leave the house. As the list grew longer, another realization emerged. None of these people had heard the story directly from me. Not one. The source always seemed to trace back through someone else. A neighbor, a family friend, someone who had spoken to Lauren. The next Saturday, Michael and Lauren stopped by for lunch. I watched more closely than usual. Not suspiciously, quietly, observantly, the way someone watches a puzzle slowly come together. During the meal, Michael mentioned that a coworker was considering selling his house and downsizing. Before I could even respond, Lauren smiled and said, "A lot of people eventually realize a smaller place makes more sense." Then she glanced toward me, especially when maintaining a large house becomes difficult. The statement sounded innocent enough. In another context, I might not have noticed it, but now every word seemed connected to a larger picture. "I do not find it difficult," I replied calmly. Lauren quickly laughed. "Of course not right now." Right now? Another small phrase. Another subtle assumption about the future. After lunch, Michael left briefly to take a phone call in the backyard. Lauren remained in the kitchen helping clear dishes. As we worked, she casually mentioned a retirement community located about 20 miles away. She spoke about the walking trails, the clubhouse, and the maintenance-free lifestyle. The details sounded oddly specific. Too specific. Almost rehearsed. I listened without interrupting. Then I simply said, "I have never considered moving there." For a fraction of a second, her expression changed. The smile remained, but something behind it seemed surprised. "Really?" she asked. "I just assumed you might someday." Someday. Another word about a future I had never discussed. That night, I could not stop thinking about the conversation. Not because of what Lauren said, but because of how natural it seemed for her to imagine me leaving. It was as though she had spent so much time picturing that outcome that she no longer realized she was talking about it aloud. I walked through my house before going to bed. The living room, the den, the kitchen where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals. Every room carried memories. Every room belonged to a life I had built over decades. Standing in the hallway, I suddenly understood what bothered me most. Lauren was not treating my home as a place I currently lived. She was treating it as a place she expected to inherit emotionally long before anyone had given her that right. And the more I listened, the more convinced I became that she was not the only one who had started believing it. After that conversation, I stopped dismissing my instincts. For weeks, I had been collecting small pieces of information without fully understanding what they meant. Now I began treating them differently. I started paying attention, not because I wanted conflict, but because I wanted clarity. Every time Lauren visited, I quietly noted the date and time in my notebook. Every time she entered the house, I wrote it down. Every comment about my future, every mention of downsizing, every suggestion about renovations. None of it seemed dramatic on its own, but together, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A few days later, I left the house early to attend a doctor's appointment. The appointment lasted less than an hour. Instead of returning home immediately, I stopped at a nearby bookstore and spent some time browsing. It was a pleasant morning, and I enjoyed moving slowly through the aisles. When I finally returned home shortly after noon, I noticed Lauren's car pulling away from my driveway. She did not see me. I watched as she turned the corner and disappeared down the street. A strange feeling settled over me. She had not called. She had not texted. She had not mentioned stopping by. When I entered the house, nothing appeared wrong. Yet several small details immediately caught my attention. The guest bedroom door was open. I always kept it closed. A drawer in the dining room buffet was not pushed in completely. A decorative lamp had been moved slightly. Once again, nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. But someone had clearly been walking through rooms that did not require checking. That evening, I called Michael. I kept the conversation casual. Eventually, I asked whether Lauren had mentioned visiting my house earlier that day. There was a pause. "No," he said. "Why?" I quickly changed the subject. But after we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The fact that Lauren entered my home without telling me was concerning. The fact that she had not mentioned it to Michael either bothered me even more. The following weekend brought another unexpected moment. I attended a community fundraiser at the local church. While speaking with several neighbors, I overheard part of a conversation nearby. My name caught my attention. I was not trying to listen, but the words carried clearly across the room. "Lauren says Evelyn is eventually looking for something smaller," one woman said. "She told me the house is probably too much for her now." I felt my stomach tighten. The woman was not being malicious. She genuinely believed she was discussing my plans. Plans that did not exist. For the first time, I realized how successful the narrative had become. People were no longer asking if I might move someday. They were speaking as though the decision had already been made. That night, I opened my notebook again. Page after page was filled with observations, dates, conversations, comments, assumptions. As I reviewed everything, one truth became increasingly clear. Lauren was not merely imagining a future for my house. She was quietly helping other people imagine it too. And the more often she repeated the story, the more real it became in the minds of everyone around her. I closed the notebook and looked around the living room. The framed photographs, the old piano, Richard's favorite chair. Every object represented a lifetime of memories. Suddenly, I understood why this situation felt so personal. It was not about property. It was not even about a spare key anymore. It was about respect. Somewhere along the way, Lauren had stopped seeing me as the owner of this home and started seeing me as a temporary obstacle standing between her and the future she wanted. And for the first time, I began wondering how far she was willing to go to make that future seem inevitable. The moment I finally stopped doubting myself came entirely by accident. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon about 6 weeks after I had given Lauren the spare key. I had spent the morning running errands and decided to stop at a small cafe near the edge of town for a late lunch. The cafe was busy, so I took the only available table near the back patio. I was halfway through a cup of tea when I heard a familiar voice. At first I paid little attention. Then I realized it belonged to Lauren. She was seated several tables away with another woman. Neither of them had noticed me. I was not trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I considered leaving. But then I heard my own name. Instinctively, I remained where I was. Lauren laughed softly. Honestly, it is only a matter of time, she said. Her friend asked a question I could not fully hear. Lauren leaned forward and replied in a lower voice. The house will be mine eventually anyway. For a moment, everything around me seemed to disappear. The noise of the cafe faded. The conversations nearby blurred together. I simply sat there staring into my tea. The words were not angry. They were not emotional. That was what made them so disturbing. She sounded certain, comfortable, as though she was discussing a future she had already accepted as fact. Her friend said something about how beautiful the property was. Lauren smiled. It has good bones. It just needs updates. Updates. The same word she used when talking about my furniture. My curtains. My living room. My future. I quietly stood, left money on the table, and walked out without being seen. During the drive home, I felt surprisingly calm. Not because I was happy about what I had heard. Quite the opposite. The calm came from certainty. For weeks, I had been collecting pieces of a puzzle. Questions from neighbors. Rumors about retirement communities. Uninvited visits. Comments about renovations. Suggestions about downsizing. For the first time, all of it fit together. When I arrived home, I went directly to my desk and opened the notebook. I wrote down every detail I could remember. The date, the time, the exact words. Then I reviewed everything I had gathered over the previous several weeks. Looking at the pages spread across my desk felt different now. Before, they represented concerns, possibilities, suspicions. Now they represented a pattern. That evening, Michael called to check on me. As usual, he sounded warm and attentive. Listening to his voice only deepened my sadness. I truly did not believe he understood what was happening. If he knew, he hid it remarkably well. But nothing I had seen suggested he was part of Lauren's narrative. He seemed to accept whatever story she presented without questioning it. After we ended the call, I walked through the house one room at a time. The family photographs. The bookshelves Richard built with his own hands. The old dining table where birthdays and holidays had been celebrated for decades. This house was not simply a building. It was a record of an entire life. Standing in the living room, I made a decision. I would not confront Lauren immediately. I would not argue. I would not accuse. Instead, I would allow the truth to reveal itself completely. Because now I knew something important. Lauren no longer viewed my house as my home. In her mind, she had already started treating it as her future. And that belief was about to become her biggest mistake. The following week, I invited Michael and Lauren to dinner. I chose a Friday evening because it was a time when everyone was usually available and relaxed. The invitation sounded completely ordinary. There was no hint of what I planned to discuss. No suggestion that anything unusual was coming. In fact, that was intentional. I wanted the evening to feel normal. I wanted everyone to arrive with the same expectations they always had. Throughout the day, I prepared several of Michael's favorite dishes. The house smelled of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and herbs from my garden. By the time they arrived, the dining room looked warm and welcoming. Family photographs sat on the shelves. Candles glowed softly on the table. Everything appeared exactly as it had for years. During dinner, Conversation flowed easily. Michael talked about work. Lauren shared a story about a community event. We laughed. We ate. Anyone watching would have seen an ordinary family gathering. But beneath the surface, I was paying close attention. Several times, Lauren made casual comments about future plans. At one point, she mentioned that larger homes often became difficult for older homeowners to manage. Later, she joked about how much storage space the house offered. Michael barely noticed the remarks. I noticed every one of them. After dessert, I cleared the dishes and brought coffee into the living room. Then I sat down across from them and quietly placed a small folder on the coffee table. Immediately, Lauren's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Michael looked curious. "What is that?" he asked. I folded my hands and took a slow breath. There are a few things I wanted to discuss. My voice remained calm, steady, the same voice I had used throughout the evening. I opened the folder and removed several pages from my notebook. Then I began sharing what had happened over the previous weeks. The neighbors who believed I was moving. The conversations at church. The comments about retirement communities. The unannounced visits to my home. The repeated suggestions about renovations and future ownership. Michael listened quietly. At first, he seemed confused, then concerned. I showed him the dates I had recorded, the specific conversations, the consistent pattern that had emerged. I was careful not to accuse anyone. I simply presented facts, one by one, slowly, methodically. Lauren attempted to laugh off some of the examples. She described them as misunderstandings, coincidences, harmless assumptions. But the more information I shared, the more difficult those explanations became. Finally, I described what I had overheard at the cafe. The exact words. "The house will be mine eventually anyway." The room became very quiet. Michael looked at Lauren. Lauren looked down at her coffee cup. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Michael asked a simple question. "Did you say that?" The question hung in the air between them. Lauren hesitated. It was only a brief pause, but it told me everything I needed to know. In that moment, the issue was no longer about proving anything. The truth had already revealed itself. I looked around the room that Richard and I had built together over decades. The room where birthdays had been celebrated, holidays shared, memories created. Then I reached into my pocket and placed a small object on the coffee table. It was the spare house key, the same key that had started everything. And as both of them stared at it, they realized the conversation was not over yet. For a long moment, nobody moved. The small silver key sat on the coffee table between us, looking ordinary and insignificant. Yet somehow it carried the weight of everything that had happened during the previous several weeks. Michael stared at it first. Then he looked at Lauren. The disappointment in his expression was impossible to miss. I felt no satisfaction seeing it. Only sadness. Sadness that a simple act of trust had led us here. Finally, I broke the silence. "Lauren," I said gently, "I would like my key back." My voice remained calm. There was no anger in it. No accusation. Just a clear request. Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to argue. Then she slowly reached into her purse and placed the spare key beside the one already on the table. The soft metallic sound echoed through the quiet room. Michael lowered his eyes. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Lauren finally looked at me. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said. I considered her words carefully. Perhaps she believed them. Perhaps she did not. Either way, I had spent enough time trying to understand her intentions. What mattered now were the actions, the assumptions, the boundaries that had slowly disappeared after that key changed hands. I nodded politely. "I appreciate that," I replied. But intentions do not change what happened. The conversation that followed was quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices. Michael asked questions. Lauren answered some of them. Others she struggled to explain. The further the discussion went, the clearer the situation became. Somewhere along the way, she had begun imagining a future that belonged to her. Then she started talking about that future as though it were already inevitable. The problem was not that she imagined it. The problem was that she stopped respecting the present. She stopped respecting the fact that I was still here, still living in my home, still making my own decisions, still fully capable of determining my own future. Eventually, the evening came to an end. Michael remained behind for a few minutes after Lauren walked outside. He sat beside me in the living room and quietly shook his head. "I should have paid more attention," he said. I reached over and squeezed his hand. This is not about choosing sides, I told him. It is about understanding boundaries. He nodded slowly. I could see he finally understood. Not just the issue with the key, but everything underneath it. Trust, respect, ownership, dignity. After he left, the house became quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. Peaceful. Familiar. I walked through each room before going to bed. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway lined with family photographs. Everywhere I looked, I saw the life Richard and I had built together. Not the future someone else imagined. My future. My choices. My home. Before turning off the lights, I returned the spare keys to the kitchen drawer where they had always been kept. Then I closed the drawer and smiled. The truth was, I had not really been fighting for a key. I had been fighting for something much more important. The right to be respected in my own home. The right to have my voice matter. The right to decide what came next in my life. And as I stood there in the quiet house, I realized I had finally reclaimed all of it. The house remained exactly where it had always been. So did I. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like more than enough.